This is a really good interview here with Peter Fury. And in this interview, he's asked about Anthony Joshua's performance against Alexander Usyk and what AJ does moving forward. And one of the things that he says, which is something I've also been saying for many years, is that Anthony Joshua hasn't yet fulfilled his potential. I completely agree. Now, I know a lot of people disagree. They think that AJ has reached his ceiling a long time ago and he can't get any better. But I'm going to explain to you why I disagree and what I think needs to be done for AJ to actually fulfill his potential. Now, I said since the very start of Anthony Joshua's career that I was uneasy. I didn't like the fact that he was being moved along while in the public eye. So he wins the Olympic gold medal, turns pro, and there's all this fanfare. And that type of fanfare brings with it pressure. It brings with it the expectation to perform. It brings with it unrealistic expectations from the fans that they put on the fighter's shoulders. It doesn't allow a fighter to develop psychologically as well as technically, as well as they would if they are, let's say, fighting in a more low-key fashion, lower down the card without all the fanfare. Because then they can work on what they need to work on without all the pressure, without feeling like they have to impress every time. It's a learning process. They're going to school. So I expressed those reservations early on. Go look at my old videos. When AJ first turned, I expressed those reservations early on. And then, of course, AJ fought Dylan White in whatever it was, his 14th or 15th fight. And then he's fighting for the world title right after. And again, I expressed my reservation that this is too soon. Even if he beats Charles Martin, he's then going to be a world champion. And he's going to have to face mandatories. He's in at the deep end at that point. And I always felt that AJ hadn't learned to swim properly. He needed to stay in the shallow end a bit longer to develop his skills and become a more complete fighter before stepping him in to the deep end. Now, for those who say that AJ was just completely manufactured and he was never any good, well, let me cast your minds back, and I'm sure many of you have never actually looked at this, to Anthony Joshua's amateur career. Not the Olympics, because many people only know about Anthony Joshua in the Olympics. But no, in the World Championships. So here we have Anthony Joshua's record in the World Championships. Now, in fact, where are we at? Yeah, there we go. World Championships in 2011. So in the World Championships, look at all the fights that he had. The World Championships took place in Azerbaijan. This was not in the UK. This was not some home cooking or anything like that. AJ, when he'd only had 20-something or 30-something amateur fights, went to Azerbaijan as a total novice, and he's thrown in at the deep end against the best amateurs on the planet. And he's beaten them. Defeated this guy from Trinidad and Tobago in the first round. Defeated a guy from Mexico in the second round. Defeated a Moroccan in the third round. Defeated Roberto Camarel. Remember Camarel, who he fought in the Olympic final a year later? Yeah, he beat him in Azerbaijan. That fight is on YouTube. Go and watch it for yourselves. Okay, there was no robbery or anything like that. This was not in the UK. This was in Azerbaijan. AJ beat Camarel. Beat Eric Pfeiffer in the next round. And he got all the way to the final, where he was fighting an Azerbaijani in the final in front of the Azerbaijani president. And as you can see, AJ lost by a single point, 22-21. Now, for a novice as inexperienced as AJ was at the time to go into a major international amateur tournament like this and reach the final, that is virtually unheard of. I don't know how many of you actually know that much about amateur boxing, but for a guy with such little experience to get that far in the World Championships is a very, very rare thing indeed. You don't do that unless you have some talent. And of course, with AJ, he was getting by on his size, his athleticism, and so on, more so than his skills. Because if you watch AJ in those World Championships, You can see the athleticism, you can see the speed, you can see the power, but you can also see the rawness in terms of his technique. He's underdeveloped compared to the people he's fighting technically. So anyway, he goes on and has the Olympics and all that kind of stuff, where he did get a gift decision against Erislandi Savon, no doubt, but he also beats Zheli Zhang, Ivan Ditchko. The Camarel fight for me was close. That was a legitimately close fight. I don't think it was a particularly bad decision. Would it have gone AJ's way if the fight had been on neutral territory or in Italy? Probably not, but I don't necessarily have an issue with that result. It was more the Erislandi Savon result where it was pretty shocking. AJ lost that fight. But anyway, he had plenty of legitimate wins in his amateur career. And this is something I said in a previous video. Lots of fighters, even great fighters, end up getting gift decisions at some point in their career. It doesn't invalidate the previous legitimate wins that they had. You see, but people seem to think it does. I've got very short memories. In any event, AJ had potential there. He could have been brought along the right way to maximize and fulfill that potential, but instead, because of, I don't know, naivety, greed, impatience, however you want to describe it, he was fast-tracked instead. So let's have a look at his professional career here, and we will compare it. For anyone who's in any doubt that he was fast-tracked, we'll compare it not only to his contemporaries, like Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, but we'll also compare it to some of the greats in Lennox Lewis and Mike Tyson. So AJ's 15th professional fight, let's start there because that's the first time he fought somebody with a pulse, was against Dillian Whyte. Lennox Lewis's 15th fight, and I think he did fight pretty good opposition at this point. He was definitely fighting Gary Mason around then. Yeah, he fought Gary Mason. Who's better, Gary Mason or Dillian Whyte? I think they're at a very similar level, actually. And there's quite a lot of similarities in their careers, up until a certain point, at least, with Gary Mason and Dillian Whyte. I would say Gary Mason and Dillian Whyte are at a similar level. So let's say AJ and Lennox Lewis fought a similar level opponent in their 15th fight. Lewis goes on to fight Mike Weaver, Glenn McCrory, who's a former cruiserweight champion, Tyrell Biggs, who's, washed up, Levi Billups, and so on. Anthony Joshua goes on to fight, where are we at? Charles Martin, Dominic Brazil, Eric Molina. I mean, this is a similar level to what Lewis was fighting with regards to Mike Weaver, Glenn McCrory, and Tyrell Biggs. It's a similar level. In his 19th fight, Lennox Lewis fights Levi Billups. In Anthony Joshua's 19th fight, he fights Vladimir Klitschko. Now, there is no way, there is no type of mental gymnastics that you could perform to try and convince anyone who isn't completely insane that Levi Billups was a better opponent than Vladimir Klitschko for your 19th fight. When I say better, I don't mean the ideal opponent for your development as a fighter. I'm just talking about how good the opponent actually was. Vladimir Klitschko obviously was several orders of magnitude better than Levi Billups. Okay, but that's who they both fought in their 19th fights. Anthony Joshua fought Klitschko, Lennox Lewis fought Levi Billups. In Lewis's 20th fight, he fought Derek Williams for the Commonwealth heavyweight title. Tremendous uppercut that Lewis knocked Williams out with in that fight. Anthony Joshua, in his 20th fight, faces Carlos Takam. Now, I would say Carlos Takam is better than Derek Williams. Definitely, I would say better than Derek Williams. Lewis's next fight, he fights Mike Dixon, who's a journeyman. AJ fights Joseph Parker. God, I'm getting all muddled up here. AJ fights Joseph Parker in his 21st fight, whereas Lewis is fighting Mike Dixon. Again, Joseph Parker's much better than Mike Dixon. Go and have a look at Mike Dixon fight, people. I can assure you Joseph Parker is a lot better than Mike Dixon. AJ then fights Alexander Povetkin in his 22nd fight. And at this point, AJ's at world title level. Lewis is still not at world title level by the time he's in his 22nd fight. So he fights Povetkin, who's an Olympic gold medalist, former WBA regular champion, only one loss to Vladimir Klitschko. And in Lewis's 22nd fight, he fights Razor Ruddock. Now, Razor Ruddock at the time was a danger man. He was seen by most as the best heavyweight in the world behind Mike Tyson, who had gone to prison. So a lot of people saw him as the heir apparent, although in retrospect, that definitely wasn't the case because you had the Riddick Bowes and the Evander Holyfields, although neither of them fought Razor Ruddock, to be fair, but they went on to achieve more than Razor Ruddock, certainly. But Razor Ruddock had those 2 fights with Mike Tyson, and that's really where he built his reputation because he didn't do that much outside of the Tyson fights. And he lost both of those fights, obviously, but he gave a good account of himself. So Lewis knocked out Razor Ruddock in 2 rounds, and that was a good win for him against a dangerous guy. And as I say, Anthony Joshua, in his 22nd fight, was fighting Povetkin. Which was more dangerous, Povetkin or Ruddock? I would say they're comparable. Certainly, Povetkin was a lot more accomplished than Ruddock, professional and amateur, so you could argue that Povetkin was better. Although he was older, I think Povetkin was like 37 or 38 by this point. So you can definitely throw that in there. But I would still say that they're comparable fighters. Even Povetkin at this age is comparable to a Razor Ruddock. So again, at this point, when they're 22-0, Anthony Joshua has actually got a better resume than Lennox Lewis. That's a fact. It's not me speculating or any of that kind of stuff. Anthony Joshua had a better resume through his first 22 fights. He'd been much tougher than Lennox Lewis through his first 22. No doubt. Right? Anyone who knows their boxing and actually has an objective mind cannot disagree with what I'm saying. So if AJ is this coddled fighter who hasn't been fast-tracked and has actually been protected, then how do you explain the fact that he was actually moved faster than Lewis, so he fought for a title sooner? He's fighting guys like Klitschko in his 19th fight, when Lewis is fighting Levi Billups. How do you explain all this if AJ is supposed to be this protected fighter? So anyway, he then fights Andy Ruiz in his 23rd fight. Lennox Lewis in his 23rd fight is facing Tony Tucker, former champion, only one loss, which was to Mike Tyson. So, Tucker's a decent opponent for your first defense. So again, these are probably comparable opponents to Andy Ruiz. Tony Tucker, Frank Bruno, these kind of guys. Although I would pick Andy Ruiz over Frank Bruno for sure. I think Ruiz would definitely get to him with the fast hands and the pressure, and Bruno's notoriously bad stamina. But Tony Tucker was, I would say, more comparable because that was a 12-round fight for Lennox Lewis rather than the 7-round fight that he had with Bruno. But in any case, he goes on after that to fight Phil Jackson, who wasn't really up to much in his 25th fight. Anthony Joshua in his 25th fight is fighting Kubrat Pulev. I can assure you, Kubrat Pulev is better than Phil Jackson. Go and watch Phil Jackson, folks. He's a fighter from Miami, Florida. I think he started at light heavyweight. He turned pro at light heavyweight, then moved up. This guy's not as good as Kubrat Pulev. So, again, through the first 25 fights, AJ's resume is better than Lennox Lewis. It is what it is. I'm just being objective. I'm just looking at the facts, looking at the fighters, comparing the resumes up until this point. And AJ's resume up until this point was better than Lewis's resume. Now, Lewis's career continued on after that, and he developed a very good resume, which has obviously surpassed what AJ has done so far, clearly. So Lewis, overall, in the however many fights he had, was it 40 fights or something like that in Lewis's career, he's got a better resume than AJ, no doubt. But I'm just talking about up until their first 26, 27 fights, because AJ's only had 27 fights so far. And if you compare their first 27 fights, AJ's resume is better. Fought Usyk twice, of course, in his 26th and 27th fights, whereas Lewis was fighting McCall and Lionel Butler. So there you go. If you compare it to Mike Tyson's resume, it's a similar thing. Mike Tyson didn't fight for the world title until his 28th professional fight. Okay, Lewis didn't fight for the world title properly because he fought an eliminator against Razor Ruddock. He fought for the world title in his 23rd fight. AJ fought for the world title against Charles Martin in his 16th fight. Even if you don't want to count that as a world title because it was an easy champion to beat, let's say it starts from his 19th fight, just for argument's sake. So his 19th fight is facing Klitschko, but Lewis doesn't fight for the world title or a world title eliminator until several fights later in his 22nd against Razor Ruddock. So again, if AJ isn't being fast-tracked or hasn't been fast-tracked, then explain to me why Lennox Lewis, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, was actually moved more slowly. Explain this to me, people. If you're disagreeing with my contention that AJ's fast-tracked, show me with facts why he wasn't. Not any convoluted mental gymnastics. Show me with facts. So with Mike Tyson, he fights cream puffs. Okay, so we can skip over all the cream puffs until we get to his first meaningful fight, which would have been Jesse Ferguson. So the first time that Mike Tyson fought anybody with a pulse, I can assure you, was his 18th professional fight against Jesse Ferguson. Everybody prior to that was a punch bag. That's what they were. They were all punch bags that Mike Tyson fought. Stiffs. Until the Jesse Ferguson fight. Now, some people say David J. Cole was a bit of a tough guy. I mean, yeah, not really. He did beat Razor Ruddock, but that's about it. Mike Tyson knocked him out in one round. If you ever watch David J. Cole fight, you probably laugh. But anyway, first opponent with a pulse was Ferguson in his 18th fight. And by this time, of course, AJ's gearing up to fight Vladimir Klitschko, right? In his 18th fight, let's bring AJ's record over here. Yeah, he's about to fight Klitschko in his 19th fight. Mike Tyson is fighting Jesse Ferguson. And in Tyson's 19th fight, he fights Steve Zalski. Now, are you going to try and tell me that Steve Zalski was a tougher test than Vladimir Klitschko for your 19th fight? Is that what you guys are trying to tell me out there? Because I hear so many people say, oh no, AJ wasn't rushed. If anything, he's been taken very slowly and coddled because he's no good. Really? Okay, well, here we go. Tyson in his 19th fight is fighting Steve Zalski. He then fights James Tillis, which was a good learning fight for him. Tillis was a tough guy at the time in his 20th fight. Again, AJ's fighting Takam. I would say Takam is better than Tillis, or it's certainly comparable opponent. So anyway, we can skip all this. Mike Tyson never fights anyone really dangerous. You know, he never fights any dangerous punches or anything like that until his 29th fight against James Bone Crusher Smith. Trevor Berbick, of course, when he wins the world title. Berbick was a decent fighter, nothing special, definitely one of the weaker heavyweight champions in history. Was he worse than Charles Martin? No. I would pick Trevor Berbick over Charles Martin, but still, he wasn't that great. You know, this is not a Hall of Fame heavyweight in Trevor Berbick. But the first time that Mike Tyson faced a puncher was his 29th fight against James Bone Crusher Smith. Because these guys are not punchers. You know, James Tillis is not a puncher. Mitch Green, well, James Tillis had some kind of power, but it wasn't like serious, elite level punching power. Mitch Green wasn't a puncher. You know, Jesse Ferguson was never really a puncher. He's not facing any serious punches until, as I say, his fight against Bone Crusher Smith in his 29th fight. That's the first time he's facing a puncher. Anthony Joshua, on the other hand, well, Dylan White is a puncher, but Vladimir Klitschko, one of the best punchers in the division, in his 19th fight. Mike Tyson doesn't face a puncher, a serious puncher, until his 29th fight, 10 fights later. So explain to me why you think that AJ wasn't rushed. Explain this to me. I need someone to tell me, because it just sounds like a bunch of gaslighting out there. Everybody just trying to gaslight and say stuff repetitiously enough times to the point where people believe it without even thinking about it, without analyzing what's actually been said, being said. So, yeah, Mike Tyson, of course, he's in a championship level now, fighting from his 28th fight on, he's fighting world title fights. And he's fighting the best fighters in the division at the time. There's no doubt. When Mike Tyson was champion, he was going for the gusto. He was doing what Usyk is doing. Yeah? Usyk didn't mess around at cruiserweight. He got straight in there, and he's fighting all the best fighters. He'll take them on in their backyard, whatever. He wanted to be undisputed, not messing around. Mike Tyson did the same once he stepped up to championship level. Tyson wanted all the smoke with everyone. So that's one thing you always have to give Mike Tyson credit for. It wasn't a particularly strong era. He's mostly fighting Larry Holmes leftovers and including, a comeback in Larry Holmes himself. But he's mostly fighting Larry Holmes leftovers. A lot of these guys had drug and drink problems and what have you. But nonetheless, that was the best that was around at the time. And Tyson was willing to fight everybody. So you got to give him credit for that. Anyway, let's compare AJ's resume now to his contemporaries, because people might try and bring up, oh, well, it's just a coincidence that Lennox Lewis and Tyson were moved a bit more slowly than AJ. That's just a coincidence. Or maybe it was to do with the politics at the time with promoters and Lewis and Mike Tyson not being able to get a title shot sooner. They would have, they could have, etc. If people are trying to make those arguments, well, again, let's compare AJ's resume and how fast he was moved to Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder. So let's start with Tyson Fury. So again, AJ's first opponent with a pulse was Dillian Whyte, and that would have been 15th fight. Tyson Fury, in his 15th fight, he's facing Derek Chisora. Now that's comparable, I would say. Yeah, if you're fighting Derek Chisora, Dillian Whyte, that's a comparable, please ignore the phone vibrating, but that's a comparable opponent. So I would say that up until this point, they're fighting at a similar level of opposition. Although, of course, you had the John McDermott fights. In fact, let me rewind because I made a mistake there. John McDermott had a pulse. Let's rewind. John McDermott definitely had a pulse. Was John McDermott as good as Dillian Whyte? No. John McDermott has never been as good as Dillian Whyte, but he did have a pulse. He was there to win. He did try hard. And many people believe that he should have got his hand raised at the end of the 8 rounds in the first Fury fight. So, yeah, that's what I will say. So he fought somebody with a pulse in his 8th fight, McDermott, and again in his 11th fight. So you could say maybe at this stage that Fury was actually being moved a bit quicker than AJ. All right, so 15th fight against Chisora again. You could say, yeah, this is a bit quicker. But then we go into AJ's 16th, 17th, and 18th. Charles Martin, Brazil, Molina. Fury was Further, Pikage, and Rogan. These guys are not as good as Martin, Brazil, and Molina. Martin, Brazil, and Molina are better than Nikolai Further, Pikage, and Rogan. No doubt. So AJ's kind of overtaking him here up until we get to this point. AJ starts overtaking. In his 19th fight, he fights Madelone. And of course, in AJ's 19th fight, he's fighting Klitschko. So there's absolutely no question that by the time they're 19-0, AJ has been moved much faster and he's fought a much better level of opponent. He's fought Klitschko in his 19th fight. And it doesn't matter whether it's Klitschko at the end of his career or whatever. There's no version of Vinny Madelone that's better than Vladimir Klitschko, folks. So again, like for like, AJ's been moved faster at this point. In the 20th fight, AJ's fighting Carlos Takam. Tyson Fury's fighting Kevin Johnson. I'm saying Takam's a better fighter. 21st fight, he's fighting Steve Cunningham. Now, Steve Cunningham's a good fighter. He's coming towards the end of his career. He must be, 35, 36 when he fought Tyson Fury. There or thereabouts. Gives Fury a very, very tough fight. Fury says this is actually the toughest fight of his career against Steve Cunningham. In AJ's 21st fight, he's facing Joseph Parker. I'm saying that Joseph Parker's better at heavyweight than Steve Cunningham. Now, Steve Cunningham did good things as a cruiserweight, but I'm saying as a heavyweight, Joseph Parker is better. And if you really want to make an argument of it, you could say, if you wanted to, well, maybe Steve Cunningham's a bit better or he's more clever or whatever the case may be. They're at the very least in the same ballpark. Let's just put it that way. So after that, Tyson Fury fights Joey Abel in his 22nd fight. In Anthony Joshua's 22nd fight, he's fighting Povetkin. There is no way on God's green earth that you could try and argue that Joey Abel is better than Alexander Povetkin. So again, through 22 fights, AJ has faced a much tougher competition. He's fighting world championship level at this stage. And the opponents are just, for the most part, not comparable. 23rd fight is the rematch with Derek Chisora. Now, we know Derek Chisora always brings it. Tough guy, applies a lot of pressure. Fury dealt with him nicely in the second fight. That was 23 fights in. 23 fights in, AJ fights Andy Ruiz. You could say comparable opponents. But again, at this stage, Anthony Joshua is a world champion. He's got mandatory obligations. He can't pick and choose his opponents to the extent that a contender can, because a contender doesn't have to defend against anybody. A contender doesn't have the pressure on them to fight this guy or that guy or the other guy the way that a champion does. You see? And this is again why it's unwise to do what they did with someone like Anthony Joshua, who, although he achieved a lot of things as an amateur, he was still inexperienced. He was getting by on athleticism and strength and all that kind of stuff, power, rather than technique. His technique wasn't developed the right way, the way Tyson Fury's was. Fury was given more learning fights before he stepped up to fight Vladimir Klitschko in his 25th fight. He was given more learning fights than Anthony Joshua before stepping up to world level. He was brought along at a much better pace, in a much more sensible fashion, without all the fanfare and the ridiculous amounts of expectation and pressure that were heaped on AJ's shoulders. Okay? So this is not even a critique of Tyson Fury's resume up until his first world title shot. No, this is actually me praising the way Fury was brought along and saying that this is the way you do it. Yeah, this is the way you're supposed to bring a guy along. Excuse me, here. This is how you bring a fighter along. You know, tests along the way, yes, but nothing crazy and not with all the ridiculous pressure, the unnecessary pressure. Stepping him up to world title level too quick. You got to make sure a guy is not only physically ready, technically ready, but also mentally ready for all this stuff. I've never been a fan of just throwing a guy in, you know, particularly when he doesn't have the experience of, let's say, a Lomachenko, Usyk in the amateurs. AJ never had that level of experience. So you're taking a guy who's still raw and novice-y and you're throwing him into big arena fights and all this kind of stuff early in his career. No, I never thought that was a good idea for any fighter who's so lacking in experience. But anyway, Tyson Fury goes on. You know, Sefer Safiri, Pianetta after the hiatus, and of course AJ, what we know, there's the Pulev and the Usyk fights. But really, my comparison between them isn't what they've done in their past few fights, but it's up until championship level. Yeah, the development stages of their careers. Tyson Fury had a longer development period, and I think he's benefited from that longer development period. AJ had a very short development period before they threw him in at the deep end. Again, we can compare it to Deontay Wilder. I've done it in a separate video. With Wilder, it's almost comical because Wilder was fighting absolute stiffs up until Berman-Stavern. That's what he was doing. He was fighting nothing but stiffs until his 33rd fight. And of course, AJ hasn't even had 33 fights yet. So their resumes are not at all comparable. Certainly through the first, what's AJ on now? 27? So AJ's had 27 fights. You compare the first 27 fights of AJ to the first 27 fights of Wilder, and there is no comparison. Wilder was fighting nothing but pure stiffs. Matthew Greer, Kelvin Price, Damon McCreary, Kirsten Mansell, Owen Beck, Jesse Altmans. I mean, these are the guys he's fighting in his first 27 fights. There's nobody. Literally nobody. The first name that most people will, I mean, I know some of these names, the journeyman and whatever. But in terms of, you know, I know Owen Beck and Kirsten, these are journeymen. Well, Owen Beck was a contender at a time, but by the time Wilder fought him, he was totally done. So, yeah, most people won't be familiar with these names. The first name they'll be familiar with on Wilder's record is Audley Harrison in his 28th fight. I mean, the less said about that fight, the better. But he was 28 fights in before he fought Harrison. Then he fought Sergey Lykovich, who's a former WBO champion, but way, way, way past his best. Stopped him in a round. Nikolai Firther, Malik Scott, I mean, that fight was a joke. Jason Gavin, and finally, somebody with a pulse in Berman Stavern, 33 fights in. So, again, somehow there's this narrative that AJ hasn't been fast-tracked. Well, if he hasn't been fast-tracked and he was moved slowly, then what do you call the way that Deontay Wilder was moved? If AJ's been moved slowly and not been given tough fights soon enough, I mean, everybody has to agree the Usyk fight is a tough fight, right? If he's not been given tough fights soon enough, what on earth do you call Deontay Wilder's career then? He didn't fight anybody with a pulse until he was 38-0. Or excuse me, 32-0 when he fought Stavern first time. And I've spoken in a separate video about how the WBC laughably gave him Berman Stavern in a rematch for a mandatory. I mean, just unbelievable. Unbelievable. And that was 2 years into his reign. I don't think any of these guys were mandatories, were they? Fought Stavern in January 2015, and then fought a mandatory with Stavern in 2017. So that's like 2 years without a mandatory. And Stavern only had one fight between the first and second Wilder fights, and that was against a journeyman in Derek Rossi. Just to show you how cozy the relationship is between Wilder's people and the WBC. I mean, talk about a cherry-picked mandatory. I mean, mandatories are not supposed to be able to be cherry-picked. They're supposed to be forced upon you. Tough fights forced upon you by your sanctioning body. But in the case of Wilder, no. They allowed him to have absolute cream puff mandatories, relatively speaking. Because there were much tougher fighters out there for him than Berman Stavern. But somehow they've given him Stavern, who was like 40 at the time or whatever he was. Got dropped against Derek Rossi, that journeyman in between, and it's just unreal. So, I think I've proven to anyone who's reasonable that my point is valid. Anthony Joshua was rushed. He was moved faster than Lewis, Mike Tyson, Deontay Wilder, or Tyson Fury. Despite the fact that all of these guys, well, certainly Lewis and Tyson, in fact, let me back up. Lennox Lewis had a lot more amateur experience than Anthony Joshua, yet he was moved more slowly. He had more development fights. Mike Tyson had a similar amount of experience to Anthony Joshua in the amateurs, but Mike Tyson was far more talented than Anthony Joshua. That's the difference. And also, he was adopted by a great boxing trainer. So he was living with a great boxing trainer and training in the gym. He had unlimited access to the gym growing up, Mike Tyson. He's literally been adopted by one of the great boxing trainers, and he's living in the gym all the time. Most fighters, certainly AJ, they don't have that kind of access. And they don't have that kind of knowledge right there in the house they're living in terms of boxing knowledge and experience. So although Mike Tyson had a similar number of amateur bouts to Anthony Joshua, he was far more advanced because of the fact that he's living with one of the great boxing trainers and he's got unlimited access to his gym. And he was also more talented than Anthony Joshua. So he was a similar level of experience, but even still, even with everything that Mike Tyson had over AJ in the amateurs by way of talent and by way of customado and all this kind of stuff, they still moved him slower in the pros than AJ. He still got way more development fights in the pros than AJ. Think about it. Deontay Wilder, again, similar level of experience in the amateurs to AJ, but was moved much slower, was given way more learning fights. Tyson Fury, I'm not sure how many amateur fights Fury actually had, to be fair, I don't know. Um, was it a similar amount to AJ? Was it more? I don't know. I'm not actually sure about that. In any event, he was still, as a professional, moved at a slower pace and given more development fights, more learning fights than Anthony Joshua. So please, somebody say something reasonable here. If you don't believe that AJ was rushed, if you're saying that he got enough learning fights, explain your case, because nobody, as far as I've seen or heard, has been able to do such a thing. It seems, in fact, absurd at this point to me to try and act as though AJ wasn't rushed. Of course, he was rushed. And when you rush a fighter the way that AJ was, when you rush a fighter, he's not going to be able to he's not going to be able to fulfill his potential when you rush him. You have to take him at the right pace. The pressure that comes with being a world champion, having multiple belts, trying to get by in fights. I mean, you look at the Povetkin fight. This is a guy in AJ who's clearly not the complete fighter, who clearly still has holes in his game, technical flaws. And he's in there against the guy who's technically very sound, because he had hundreds of amateur fights and was the dominant super heavyweight in the amateurs for many years. Povetkin was a menace in the amateurs at super heavyweight. Go look at Povetkin's amateur record. I mean, this guy beat everybody. He was an absolute menace. And so he was on another level technically to AJ when they fought. But AJ found a way to make his size, his height and reach, and punch and power. He found a way to compensate for his lack of polish, his lack of technique, his lack of experience. You see it. But if you bring a guy like AJ along the right way, in a similar fashion to, let's say, Tyson Fury, even if you want to take him as slow as Deontay Wilder, once he reaches championship level, his skill set is more rounded. His skill set is more developed. Very hard to, it's like those of you who have been in a fight, right? And let's say you don't have any background in boxing or martial arts. When you get in a fight, it's just pure instinct. Like when I was a kid, I get in a fight, it's pure, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm swinging all kind of crazy punches. I'm grabbing people's heads and I'm doing whatever I can. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just trying to hurt them. That is what it's like when you haven't learned enough technique. And you're going in there against people who do have technique. This is an extreme example, but I'm trying to make you understand why you need to develop a person's technique up to a certain point. Because when you're in there against a formidable foe, someone who can really hurt you, it's a life or death struggle. Your technique isn't as good as theirs, so you better hope that you could just overpower them or something. Yeah? Whereas once you learn boxing or any other martial art, and then you get into a fight on the street, it's a whole different ball game now. Now all of a sudden, because I've been boxing, I've had 10, 20 amateur fights. I know how to throw punches. I know how to block punches and defend and everything. I know how to throw a jab. Now all of a sudden, it's easy. Now all of a sudden, I can see what's going on. I understand where I need to be and what I need to do a lot better. This is why fighters need to have development fights when they're raw, when they didn't have the longest amateur background. This is why you don't just throw them in at the deep end. You got to give them time to develop that technique properly. When you're throwing them in again in life or death battles, they're not going to be able to develop their technique. Yeah. You have to once you let them develop that technique, then all of a sudden they are able to handle themselves better in those situations. From a mental perspective, from a technical perspective. Yeah. And the way you get them to that point is you give them opponents who aren't going to put them in life or death struggles. Opponents who can bring them along gradually. Where, okay, the opponent is putting up some resistance, but I've still got enough time and space to actually think okay, let me work on this punch. We were doing this in the gym. Let me try this and try that. This is how it works. And a lot of casuals don't understand this. A lot of casuals don't see the technical side of boxing as much as, we do. So that's what I'll say about that. And of course, from very early on in AJ's championship reign, I was saying that he needs to get rid of Rob McCracken because I believe that he reached his ceiling with McCracken in terms of McCracken's ceiling. As far as McCracken, with his knowledge and his way as a trainer, couldn't do any more for AJ. But I believe, and also, of course, Peter Fury believes, that AJ has more. There's levels above. He can go beyond where we've seen him so far. But I think he certainly needed to get rid of McCracken. There are some people saying he needs to get rid of Robert Garcia. They're saying Robert Garcia is a yes man. And maybe I'll cover this in a separate video. And people were saying that in the corner, Robert Garcia was telling AJ, you're winning every round. And sounds just like what Rob McCracken was saying to AJ, that, they're telling him he's doing well when he's actually not doing well. He needs people in the corner who are going to tell him, you're not doing well. You need to knock the guy out. You need to step on the gas. So I'll come on to that in a separate video. Okay. I think ultimately it's a matter of whether AJ wants to listen. That's what it boils down to. So you can be a trainer that's going to tell him what's what. But if AJ doesn't want to listen to you, it's not really going to help, is it? So ultimately, it comes down to how receptive AJ is to what his team are telling him. And based upon what Robert Garcia said in the build-up to the Usyk rematch, AJ didn't seem very receptive. Or at least he didn't seem completely receptive to what Garcia was telling him. So again, I'll cover that in a separate video. But for this video, just wanted to first of all recommend this interview with Peter Fury, where he talks about AJ and says he hasn't reached his ceiling. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that AJ's ceiling, if AJ has a higher ceiling than what we've seen so far, which is what I believe, I'm not saying that means he could beat Usyk. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that means he could beat Fury or Wilder. Not what I'm saying. All I am saying is that he could be better than what we've seen from him so far. Whether that's good enough to beat any of the fighters I just mentioned is a completely different matter. But I've got no doubt in my mind that he can be better than what we've seen so far. He can be a more complete fighter. Peter Fury believes that. I believe that. It's just going to take the right team, the right attitude, the right mindset in order to achieve it. So, yeah, I'll leave it there and I'll catch you guys on the next video. If you're tired of the biased narratives and mass censorship on mainstream platforms, and you want to be part of a community of critical thinkers who love free speech just as much as you do, then come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide variety of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&As, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high-quality MP3. We've also got an Element group where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. Unlike Discord, it has full end-to-end encryption, is decentralized, and it's 100% censorship-free. You can also send voice notes as well as much larger audio and video files than you can on Discord. So come and sign up on Patreon. There's no contract, there's no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a cup of coffee. So I'll see you over there. I'm out.